Imagine it's the late 1600s. Scotland is in a tough spot. A series of famines, known as the 7 Ill Years, has devastated the country. England, its powerful southern neighbor, is flexing its economic muscles, and Scotland is feeling left behind. The Scottish people, proud and ambitious, are desperate for a way to secure their future, to become a major player on the world stage. They need a big idea, again. And that's when a man named William Paterson steps onto the scene. Paterson was a fascinating character. He was a Scottish merchant, a risk-taker, and one of the founders of the Bank of England. He had a vision, a grand, audacious plan that he promised would make Scotland rich beyond its wildest dreams. He proposed establishing a Scottish colony on the Isthmus of Panama in a region called Darien. Why Darien? Well, look at a map. The Isthmus is a narrow strip of land connecting North and South America, with the Atlantic on one side and the Pacific on the other. Patterson's idea was brilliantly simple, at least on paper. He envisioned building a trading post, a new city called New Caledonia. Right there, ships from Europe could sail to the Atlantic side, unload their goods, transport them over land just a few miles to the Pacific side, and then ship them off to Asia and the west coast of the Americas. It would bypass the treacherous and incredibly long journey around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America. This route, he argued, would become the key to global trade, the door of the seas and the key of the universe. And Scotland would hold that key. All the wealth of the East and West would flow through their colony, making Scotland one of the wealthiest nations on Earth. It was an electrifying prospect. The Scottish public was completely captivated. This wasn't just a business venture. It was a national crusade. People from all walks of life, merchants, farmers, widows rushed to invest. They poured their life savings into the Company of Scotland, trading to Africa and the Indies, the official name of the Darien scheme. In a massive display of national pride and hope, they raised an incredible sum of money, something like £400,000 sterling. To put that in perspective, this was estimated to be about a quarter, maybe even a third, of the entire wealth of Scotland at the time. The nation had literally bet the farm on Darien. The excitement was palpable. This was Scotland's moonshot. So, in July of 1698, the first expedition set sail from the port of Leith. 5 ships, carrying around 1,200 hopeful colonists, departed amidst cheering crowds. They were filled with optimism, dreaming of gold, trade, and a new life in a tropical paradise. They carried provisions, tools, and a cargo of trade goods they thought would be perfect for the local population, things like wigs, woolen hats, and heavy blankets. This small detail gives us a hint of the problems to come. They were heading to one of the hottest, most humid places on Earth, with items suited for a cold Scottish winter. The planning, it turned out, was not as brilliant as the idea itself. When they arrived in Darien in November, the reality of their situation hit them hard. The paradise they had imagined was a sweltering, mosquito-infested jungle. The land was swampy and nearly impossible to farm. The harbor they chose, while deep, was exposed and difficult to defend. They began building their settlement, Fort St. Andrew, and laying out the streets of New Caledonia. But the work was grueling. The heat was relentless, and tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever began to spread like wildfire. The colonists started dying in droves. Their food supplies rotted in the humidity, and their attempts to grow crops failed in the poor soil. They had hoped to trade with the indigenous Guna people, but the Guna had little interest in heavy woolens, and the Spanish, who had claimed the territory for centuries, were not at all happy about this Scottish intrusion. They saw the colony as a threat to their own trade routes and colonial power. Making matters worse was the political situation back in Europe. King William III, who was king of both England and Scotland, was in a tricky position. He was trying to maintain a fragile peace with Spain and didn't want this upstart Scottish colony to ruin his diplomatic efforts. So, he issued proclamations forbidding English colonies in the Americas, like Jamaica and Barbados, from trading with or assisting the Scottish settlement. Essentially, he cut them off. The colonists at Darien were completely isolated, left to fend for themselves with no hope of resupply or support. Within 8 months, the situation was catastrophic. Sickness, starvation, and despair had taken over. Of the original 1,200 settlers, hundreds were already dead. The survivors, gaunt and broken, made the heartbreaking decision to abandon the colony. In July 1699, they packed up what little they had and set sail, trying to make their way back home or to other colonies. Many wouldn't survive the journey. The first dream of New Caledonia had ended in utter failure. But the story doesn't end there. Back in Scotland, no one knew about the disaster. Communication was so slow that by the time the news of the abandonment started trickling in, the second expedition was already on its way. 4 more ships with another 1,300 colonists set sail, just as hopeful as the first. When they arrived, they were horrified to find a ghost town, the overgrown ruins of the fort, and the graves of their predecessors. They tried to rebuild, to salvage the dream, but they faced the same impossible conditions: disease, hunger, and now, a direct military threat from the Spanish. The Spanish, seeing the weakened state of the colony, decided to crush it once and for all. They blockaded the harbor by sea and marched an army overland. The outnumbered and demoralized Scots held out for a month at Fort St. Andrew, but the outcome was inevitable. In March of 1700, they surrendered. The Darien scheme was officially over. The aftermath was devastating for Scotland. Of the roughly 2,500 people who had set sail for Darien, only a few hundred ever made it back home. The financial loss was catastrophic. A huge chunk of the nation's capital had been wiped out, leaving the country bankrupt and humbled. The dream of a Scottish trading empire had turned into a national nightmare. This disaster had profound political consequences. The economic ruin left Scotland in a very weak bargaining position with England. The English government saw an opportunity. They offered to cover the losses of the Darien investors, but there was a condition. Scotland had to agree to a political union. For many Scots, it was an offer they couldn't refuse. The Darien disaster is widely seen as the single most important factor that pushed Scotland towards the Acts of Union in 1707, which created the United Kingdom of Great Britain. The very project that was meant to secure Scotland's independence ended up being the catalyst for its loss of sovereignty. So, what can we learn from the Darien disaster? It's a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of overambition and poor planning. The initial idea was bold, but the execution was flawed from the start. They didn't do their homework. They underestimated the climate, the terrain, the local politics, and the geopolitical power of their rivals. They were driven by patriotic fervor and a get-rich-quick mentality, a dangerous combination that blinded them to the immense risks. It's a story of national pride, tragic miscalculation, and the harsh collision of dreams with reality. A financial gamble that didn't just cost money, but cost lives and, ultimately, a nation's independence. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story interesting, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more dives into fascinating moments from history. See you next time.